You drive home from the conversation, and the thing is still there. Not because it went badly, because it went well. You said what you meant. The other person followed you. Not just the surface version, but the actual thing underneath it. There was a moment where you could see they understood, really understood. And for a while, that seemed to matter. That was an hour ago. Now you're in the apartment, and the state is back in its original position. The conversation was real. The understanding was real. The state was still there. That gap between saying something exactly right and feeling anything shift is what this essay is about. Not why talking fails. Talking didn't fail. It is about something more specific. Why articulating a state and moving through it are different actions. Why understanding a problem and changing the conditions producing it are not the same thing. And why people who are good at reflection tend to discover this limit later than everyone else. Underneath every attempt to talk about these things, there is an assumption so basic that most people never examine it. The assumption is this: naming something is the beginning of changing it. In a lot of situations, this is true. You identify the problem, you describe it to someone, and the description becomes something workable, a starting point for a decision, a plan, or a shift in how you're relating to someone. The articulation does something. But that works when the problem lives in a domain language can directly act on. A misunderstanding, a pattern of behavior, a decision with identifiable stakes. What this essay is about is different. The quiet wrongness, the stable life that feels narrower than it should, the functioning that is decoupled from any felt sense of participation. That is not a linguistic problem. It is a structural one. And accurately describing a structural problem does not alter the structure. You can describe a room with complete accuracy and still be inside it. Here is what actually happens when you put the state into words. You take something that is uneven, partially formed, and hard to hold in a single frame, and you produce a version of it that another person can receive. That version is real enough to be recognized. It is not identical to the experience. When you say, "My life feels too small," you have produced something communicable. What you have not produced is the full texture of a Wednesday evening in the apartment, or the specific quality of finishing a task and feeling nothing on the other side of it, or what it is like to be warm and present in a conversation while being slightly behind it at the same time. The sentence compresses all of that into something receivable. The other person gets the sentence. The actual experience stays with you. This is not a problem of honesty or precision. It is a problem of translation. Every time a state moves from the inside to the outside, something in the original does not make it across. The gap between the two is not failure. It is just how the instrument works. So when the conversation ends and the state remains, it is partly because the conversation was addressing the translation, and the original was never what got reached. The other problem is what conversations are built to do. When you bring something difficult to another person, a friend, a therapist, a partner, they can only respond with what the conversation has available. And the tools most conversations run on are a fairly limited set. Sympathy. This sounds hard. Reframing. Maybe look at it this way. Advice. Here is something you could try. Shared experience. I've felt something like that too. None of these are wrong. In the right situation, any of them can help. But they are all designed for problems that have a resolution arc, a feeling to be validated, a misread to be corrected, an action to be taken. They work when the problem is the kind that responds to being handled. What you're bringing to the conversation is not that kind of problem. It is a condition that is not in crisis. It does not need validation. It cannot be reframed into adequacy, and it has no action that obviously addresses it. So what happens is a quiet narrowing. You arrive with the actual thing. The other person, doing their genuine best, pulls it toward what can be worked with. The conversation moves to the version of your state that fits the available responses. You engage with that. Something is exchanged. And the original thing, the one that made you want to have the conversation, stays where it was. Then there is the question of insight. That is a separate problem, and it is worth being precise about. Insight is when the mechanism becomes visible. You see clearly why the state exists, the stability that slowly became the entire available space, the performance of fine that replaced actual presence, the way years of reasonable decisions accumulated into a life that fits slightly wrong. The seeing of it feels significant. It is, to a degree, significant. But insight into a mechanism is not the same as changing the conditions producing it. A person who understands exactly how they became confined is still, after the understanding, confined. The understanding changed what they can articulate. It did not change what they go home to. For people who are reflective by temperament, this is a specific and disorienting discovery. They have spent years treating self-awareness as the primary way of addressing difficulty. Clarity has always done something before. It has always moved the problem, at least partially, in some direction. Here it doesn't move. You see the structure completely. The structure stays. And this produces a second problem, which is the one people talk about least. Once you have talked about it clearly and been understood, and gained the insight, and still feel exactly the same, a particular conclusion becomes available. The conclusion is this: I have done what there is to do. Not out of passivity, out of a genuine inventory. You use the tools that have always worked. You found the words. You said them to the right person. You understood the mechanism, and the state persisted. What tends to follow is a quiet kind of foreclosure. Not despair exactly. More like having run the available options and arrived at the same place. The sense that the options have been exhausted. What that conclusion gets wrong is the premise. The tools were not inadequate in their execution. They were the wrong category of tool for this particular problem. Talking reaches what can be reached by talking. Insight clarifies what can be clarified through reflection. These are real capacities, and they do real work, just not on this. This state sits below where those instruments land. Here is the exact situation, stated plainly. You have described it correctly, several times, possibly, to several people, with improving accuracy and declining relief. The descriptions got better. The state did not respond. That is not a communication failure. It is not an insight failure. It is not evidence that you need better wording, a better listener, or a longer conversation. It is evidence that you have been applying articulation to something articulation was not going to reach, and that you have now seen the ceiling of that approach clearly enough to stop mistaking it for progress. What exists on the other side of that ceiling is not answered by more careful description. Knowing that is not the same as knowing what to do with it, but it is at least the correct problem. There is a related condition, not the silence after explaining something and staying unchanged, but the silence after actually getting the thing you worked toward, the absence where satisfaction was supposed to be. That one is next.